And we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Inside.net. My name is Cecil Phillip. And in this show, if you're new to the show, welcome. Here's where we always talk about all the new and amazing things that are happening around in the world of development. I'm really excited today because I have two very special friends of mine. Here I got Jay. Say hi to everybody, Jay.
Hey, what's going on?
And Jay's coming to us, and he's going to be talking about how we all can start diving into dev containers. We're going to talk a little bit about what they are, what can we do with them, how to configure them, how to set them up, and like all of that good stuff. And then on my right side, oh, wrong hand, this one over here. My friend Kadesha's here. She's going to be like our guest co-host for today, so super excited about that. Kadesha works at GitHub, so hopefully she could, also help add some additional spiciness to the conversation as we start talking about like all this container things, right?
Yeah. Hey.
Hey, so why don't we just go ahead and dive into it? So when I think about containers, I feel like the word containers has like causes trauma for a lot of developers, right?
I hated containers. Like that was like getting into development. Everyone was like, "Oh, like Docker was one of the first words that I heard like
Yeah.
years and years and years ago," and I was like, "I'm just trying to learn Python. Let's not bring
Yeah.
Docker into this."
I
Right.
remember when I got my very first official software engineering role, and they're just like, oh, you have to install Docker and make sure that you have the environment set up properly. And I was just like, what is this Docker? And I'm just trying to get the repo, the repository to run so I can contribute something to
Mm,
the code base.
exactly. And you know what? I'm gonna add some context to that by like going way, way, way back. So when I got my first job out of college, like software development job, and we used to use virtual machines for things, right? And so that meant like, sure, I got my laptop, my desktop, whatever. I installed whatever I needed to install. But if I needed to like run or test, I don't know, a web server, because this is before you could just like run web servers in your code. Like this is how long ago this was. You had to like copy your code into another machine to actually run a web server. But back then, like they never gave developers permissions to run web servers on their machines. I want y'all to think about how crazy this is, right? Because now you could just do like a Python simple HTTP server or Node Express thing and just run stuff on your machine. We couldn't do that before, right? We needed like a whole machine to run a web server. So we used to have to get VMs, and then there was licensing, and can I get a Windows license and set it up and networking, and like there's so many different things that had to happen. And legit, all I was trying to do was just copy my code into a thing and run it. Literally, that's all I wanted to do. Like so many other things had to happen for us to set that up, right?
Hmm.
So now when someone was like, "Oh, hey, well, you could just spit up a container and put your code in a container," and I'm just like, dude, like you know how long it takes to install a VM? It used to take anyway to install a VM, like an entire operating system. Then you got to install. Well, for me, I'm a .NET developer, so I had to install .NET and like all the things on top of it, and I still got to put my code into the thing. You know what I mean? Like that took forever. We're talking about gigs and gigs and gigs of stuff. But now I'm like, okay, I don't know what this container stuff is, but it sounds like it's helpful because it's like a fraction of the size of the VM. And I'm not trying to deal with VMs anymore. Like I'm done. Like my life has changed, and I'm never going back. And that's personally how I feel about it. You know what I mean? So when I think about just being able to have like these environments that one I have a little bit more control over, and two, so much more small in size. For me as a developer, I'm like, okay, I don't know what this new thing is, but I gotta figure it out, right? I gotta try and understand what it does. But I know for a lot of other developers, they're like, okay, we keep hearing about this container thing, and I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. I don't know what I can do with it. I understand it's the new cool DevOpsy hotness, right? Um, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it, right? So like Jay, I'm hoping you can shed some light with us as like one of the many options that folks could do it with containers in general, which is dev containers.
Yeah, so containers in general are, I mean, again, all of the slight trauma aside from just being brought on to learning yet another thing, containers are definitely a big shift in how you think about environment setup. in general, whether you're setting up for your environment on, your local machine, your laptop, whether you're talking about, a device that you don't have much control over, and in many ways, I think that's been a great addition in there. Or you're talking about your testing server, your production server, um, the people who are helping contribute to your projects or, machines as well. Being able to say we are all on the same playing field regardless of what our device is, which there's an asterisk on that, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later. Um, but whatever my device is, whatever the resources are, which again, that's kind of a whole nother issue. And that's why I really love what GitHub's been doing with CodeSpaces, because that is truly one of the first times where we were like, it doesn't matter. You could be writing this code on your microwave in the kitchen. If it supports containerization, if it has a browser, congratulations. You can now code on that microwave. Or whether you're talking about, at the end of the day, some device in an undisclosed location in a server farm somewhere far, far away, you were able to say we are all working from the same playing field.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is super powerful. And with dev containers, that took it kind of from, hey, I now need all of this knowledge of Docker and a lot of containerization and containerized tools. I'm going to mention cloud native at some point, but it got rid of a lot of that by saying now you are in your code editor of choice, whether that could be the terminal, whether that be VS Code, whether that be some of the tools from JetBrains. And from there, you can just say, okay, put me into this field, put me into the playing field, put me in, coach. Like, hey, congratulations. I'm now ready to start working on this, even though I just picked it up, even though I don't know what the underlying requirements are, none of that stuff. I can just go, oh, what is this, a Node project? I don't even know if Node's installed on my computer. Well, guess what? It is now, because you're operating inside of this containerized environment.
Yep, exactly. And what Jay is saying reminds me of I was at RubyCon recently, RubyCon RailsConf, and I was telling them about my struggle of trying to install Rails on my computer. I literally was stuck for like an hour and a half just trying to get Rails installed on my computer. And I was just like, wow, this is so much easier done in a dev container and CodeSpaces because we have a template for Rails. I just click a button, boom, 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 done. And I can get started building a Rails app, which is all I wanted to do. All I wanted to do was to say hello world in Ruby. And I couldn't do it because I was stuck trying to set up these tools or, install that particular language or framework on the computer. I still don't have Rails on my computer because I just ended up using a CodeSpace. Yeah, I just ended up using the CodeSpace template for Rails and just did it in my browser because I just couldn't figure out what the issue was. It was so frustrating.
And last thing on that, you have, this is a .NET thing. I know zero .NET. I don't know where the dot goes in the .NET. Like, that is quite literally. But no one would tell a Python developer, because they don't understand how .NET works, that oh well, you're not capable of being able to go in and find a syntax error somewhere. Like, it with a little bit of understanding, you can then jump in. So what you've done is you've opened the level of potential contribution to people who don't necessarily know the internals. If I'm a Python developer,
Exactly.
there are so many ways to set up your Python environment. There are third-party tools, there are first-party tools. You can do it straight from the Windows Store. You can I don't think you can do it from the App Store. That might be a thing that the Python team needs to talk about. But like, there are so many ways. And if you, being a JavaScript developer that's never touched Python, and the only thing that you know is white space matters, or if you're a Python developer that's never touched Node or has never touched .NET, and all you need to do is do documentation stuff, and you need to test all of that, I would rather you not know how to do any of that stuff and still have your environment set up for you so that you can make your documentation checks, you can make your tests, you can make those small syntax errors, and you can be set up and ready to go without having to figure out, okay, where do I go? Like, do I brew install something? Do I, sudo apt-get install this? Do I go to the Microsoft Store and download? Like, I don't want to know. I just want to be able to go and fix whatever the problem I saw was, and then be able to ship it. And again, containerization really helps with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the theme we're all seeing across the board is bootstrapping software projects is a non-trivial thing, regardless of whatever language or operating system, whatever it is that you're using. Basically, if you're talking about like established projects or a business that has like a long history of a lot of legacy of code and whatnot, whether it's setting up your tools or just downloading like the runtime dependencies or whatever the case is, the right version of the operating system and all of these types of things. Like bootstrapping your environment is a non-trivial thing to do. And these containers and dev containers specifically, from my perspective, makes it so much easier because now technically we could configure it once, right? And then we can all just copy the container around, you know what I mean, or the image of the container around, right? And then now just spin it up, right? And just kind of get to work, right? Start doing some of the things that we need to do. So like our time to productivity has gone from like days and maybe even a week or more for some folks to like, okay, I could like, how big is this image? It's like what, 500 megs? I can download this in like 30 seconds, right? Boom, and we're ready to go, right? Like that's a huge gain in productivity over what the alternative is.
Exactly. That's specifically where I see a lot of the value add for containers. Not the only place, but like one of the main places is for contributors to new open source projects, and B, whenever you start a new job at a new company and you have to get up and running in multiple repositories, if there's a dev container there, you're good to go because you don't have to worry about setting up the tools and making sure that you have all the variables and on your computer and making sure that you have the right access. I mean, you still have to make sure you have the right access, but making sure that you have like this tool, that tool, everything, because everything is like one-stop shop in a dev container, and you can just get up and running so much faster. And so, like, speaking of dev containers, if nobody knows what that is or how to even get started with that, Jay, like, how does somebody get started with dev containers or even creating a very simple one?
Well, I'm a read the docs person, so I would say you go to the documentation. That's at containers.dev.
Yes.
There's a wealth of information there on how to get started. And we were talking about this a little bit before we jumped into the stream, was that there are in some ways kind of two paths that you can take. You can do the I want to ensure that everybody is working on the same page as a maintainer of a project or a repo, or you can go with kind of the slightly free managed route, which is GitHub CodeSpaces, where they actually manage the dev container for you. And you just go to the repo and you can say open up a code space. And the nice part about that is if a dev container has already been configured, which we can talk about how to set that up, it will just use that. But if it doesn't exist, then GitHub has created I was called everything, including the kitchen sink, kind of a very generic image that comes with a lot of the tools that you would use for developing already created. So or already installed and set up. So from there, I mean, you're not going to have some very specific settings, but if you just need to go in and run, whatever your command is to execute that script or to test that project, you can do that and you don't have to worry much about the maintenance. So it is kind of taking it from two sides of, am I the maintainer? And if I am, then I might want to consider using this, containers.dev to build my first dev container.json file. But if I'm just a user, if I don't see that dev containers folder, that .dev containers folder, I don't have to worry about that because I can still open up a code space and still work from that environment. And then maybe that might be my first PR is to, hey, we could add a custom dev container that adds, especially if in the README, it's like run this specific command. It's like, okay, maybe we can turn that run the specific command into a dev container setting, and then you no longer have to run it. It just gets ran.
Right. So here's a question that I've always had. So who are dev containers for? And when I ask this question, I'm going to ask, I mean it from the perspective of, because I feel like dev containers came out of Microsoft, right? but then I see that there's a specification. So I kind of feel like there's this open spec of, hey, if you implement this thing this way, you can have dev containers too. You can have a dev container. I can have a dev, right? Like we could do the thing, right? So is dev containers kind of like, can we call it an open standard for having like these remote development things specifically in VS Code and in GitHub, or is there, is there like a particular type of developer that this is for? I guess is what I got.
It is. So I'm glad you asked the who, and then you started talking about kind of the different tools. I gave a talk at SoCal Linux Expo this year, breaking that down a little bit of like, hey, if you're a data scientist, you can use dev containers. Like you can set up Jupyter notebooks and have your Jupyter notebook set up and everything already pre-configured, all the tools that you need, whether you're using Conda, Mamba. I'm not a data scientist, so I'm gonna just stop there. And then you can have all of those things set up for you. And when you start talking about tools, there is a CLI, so it is usable by anyone that wants to work on npm, and you just do npm install, and you work on it from there. There's also a few editors that support it already. One of those editors, obviously VS Code. We want to support dev containers. I believe there is some support in Visual Studio, the big grown up one. That's what I call it, the grown up Visual Studio one.
Yes.
And then JetBrains. I know Writer, which is, I don't know, it's one of JetBrains tools. Writer has support, and I think they've been working on adding support to some of their other tools.
Okay.
And then the other side of that is if you're not sure what has been set up, there is that available templates space where you can see a lot of templates that have already been pre-configured, and we can go in later on how you would use those, how you would build that starting template. But there was a message in the chat from Pamela Fox that you highlighted, was like one of the best things to do is like find someone in your space that has a dev container, copy paste, because again, until you need those specifics, just starting is enough. I tell people you can often write that first dev container. It's probably 4 lines of code, maybe like 6 most, and then you have a working dev container, and then from there you can add to it as you need to add to it. So as far as who's able to use it, I'm a package maintainer. Some of my packages have dev containers installed. I'm a web developer. Some of my websites have dev containers installed. I'm not a data scientist, but I know data scientists that have dev containers installed. I can't think of any developer, maybe outside of like hardware development, which even then, I'm pretty sure you could get away with using a dev container in some aspect of that development space.
Yeah. I guess if you're using hardware, if there's some type of way that you could, I don't know, like if you need to access external things as well, right? Like, I don't know, let's say I have like, I don't know, a card reader on my desk or whatever the case is. I'm sure there's some way to like plug in USB or something like that and then have that connection funneled into the dev container. I've never tried it. I'm just making, I'm like kind of making guesses. I don't know. But that sounds like something that should be able to happen, right?
And when you talk about configuration, like, I mean, as someone who has tried to become a Linux guru in some way and be like, oh, I need to mount volumes and I need to change settings and do things like that. Again, if you're using this containerized spec, one of the benefits that you get from that is that you can set up all of that stuff and then you don't have to touch it. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about different mount ports and things like that, you might have to identify which port is which. But if you say, I am working on this particular object, or, you know, in Python, I would say, like, if I'm running PyTest and I want to make sure that I'm testing this particular folder, I don't want anybody that's working on my package, my Python package, to have to worry about, well, how do I test this? How do I know that I'm testing all the right things? If I'm a web developer and I'm using Playwright, I don't want them to have to think about, well, how do I figure out what is needed to effectively run this? All of that can be set up, and all that can not only be set up inside of the image, it can be even configured post, so that if there is a problem, if something happens, you can say, oh, hey, I've loaded up the dev container, you're in it, but by the way, we are going to have problems because I tried setting this up and it didn't, for some reason, it didn't work. And then you can kind of take it from there and start troubleshooting.
Okay. Well, so Jay, let's do this. I'm going to spin up my VS Code instance, and why don't we just, I don't know, why don't we play around and try some stuff out? Well, one second, quick question. Looks like we have a question coming in from YouTube. Tim's asking, does this work if I'm hosting my own container registry and not a Docker GCR private registry, pretty much?
To my knowledge, as long as you have a way to connect to that registry, then yes. Obviously, if there's some authentication stuff that gets in the way, I don't think that dev containers have a way to do that authentication side of it. So it does need to be public. But if you have public access to that registry, you should be able to just provide a pathway to it. And what you'll notice is we actually use GHCR images. I've used images from Docker Hub. I've even used images directly inside of my repo. And that'll be something I think that we'll probably show a little bit later.
Yeah. So essentially, it doesn't really matter the origin of the image. Of course, make sure your images are secure and don't open the door for strangers, right? Don't pick up images from random people. But at the same time, too, it's not like these images, these dev container images have to come from one place. Like you can create your own, like Jay said, you can host your own on your own private repo that might be a customized version of an existing one that you could build on top of, or you could build your own from scratch, right? But
I know people that have done that very specific thing where their entire team works off of a custom image that they designed that is, behind their walls, and then they all work off of that as their dev container.
Yeah. So that to me makes a whole bunch of sense. So what I just did, you guys probably saw a window pop up. Like I had to update Docker. I'm going to assume that you need to have Docker running, and I didn't have it running at the time, so I just put it up, and then it needed to update, so it did a thing and pops up.
If you're developing locally, yes. Docker is, I think there's a way to use it without Docker that's using another tool. I'm not going to be the person to talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure either.
That's fine.
I might find a blog post for you, but we'll just say Docker is probably the easiest way to get this up and running.
All right, cool. So let's go. So what I actually did, I have this profile. That's why you notice it just looks like vanilla VS Code. This profile has nothing installed in it, right? So if you look in install, you see it says 0, and it's giving me all these recommendations because I don't have anything installed in this profile. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to search for dev container. I'm going to control plus this a little bit, actually. It's probably
there you go.
But I just typed in dev container, and now I'm seeing like, here's some options for me to choose from. There's this dev containers one, probably the one that we're going to use. There's also this one, I think this is a bundle, and this one contains the WSL stuff, the dev container stuff, remote SSH, tunnels, whatever that is, right? It contains a bunch of other stuff, but we don't need that for this talk. But if you wanted to, you might want to check that out. Today, we're just going to use this dev container one. 18 million downloads, so that's very cool. And it's done. See, super quick. So now it's up and installed on my machine. Now, I think I can do this. I'm going to, this is all live, folks, so we're just trying stuff out as we go along. I think I can open a command palette, and I think I can say dev container. And can it not? Let's see. I can install the CLI. I'm pretty sure I can create a project in here. Can I?
You can.
Oh, I've never done that before.
Yeah, I know you can do it. Let's see. Clean up. I don't want to clone volumes. Let's start with dev containers. What does this do? No,
that just takes you to the website. There, I think is it configure?
There used to be a thing in here that
there was. Let's see, clone repository and container volume. No, that's not it. Clean up. This is where all of us being
new dev container. Is that what we're looking for? You think?
Yes, that's probably it. New dev container is probably the answer there.
Let's see.
It did the thing. See, this is why we do user studies, okay? Because when you change the name of menu items, and old people like me are like, it used to be called add.
Create.
No, it's called create. No, it's called new. You keep changing my stuff, man. Stop changing my stuff. Leave it. Anyway, so let's create a new project. I'll let you guys pick Python, Google, Python, Ruby, Rust. Pick anything. I'll type it in, and then we'll see if we can create a new one.
I mean, I'm a fan of the Python space, so
Yeah,
I
let's
will.
just go with Python.
So Python is Python 3, Python with poetry. I think there's a fast API one, isn't there?
I don't know if there's a fast API one, but
no fast API.
that's a thing that we can talk about later. Let's just do the bare bones Python 3.
Okay, Python 3, create dev container. It's doing a thing.
No, Pamela said Python.
Python it is. The people have spoken, and Python it will be. So I'm guessing what's happening now is, because I probably should have showed my Docker thing that I had running. So if you remember when I showed this window, so notice there's nothing running. If something was running, it would show here. I'm guessing what's happening, again, I'm just guessing, is that the VS Code extension is going into outer space. It's pulling down the container, right? And then it's going to run any and all of the setup scripts and things of that nature that it needs to set up. So as soon as it's done, then it should automatically switch me over. So you notice it still says starting, so it's not done yet. But I'm guessing when it's done, it'll switch me over to the environment, well, that it kind of created for us. But for now, it hasn't done that yet. So we're just gonna wait for this image to download.
While you're doing that, I have a question for you, and I will come back to why it's important. Are you using an M1 device?
Yes.
Okay.
Am I in trouble?
No, Python will be fine. It's just the next step that I was going to tell you. We might have run into a little bug. But no, this is fine. Actually, I can go ahead and talk about that now. So most of the containers themselves operate within just a standard Docker context. So you could probably even see what the image is that it's using. It's probably just the Python bullseye image, which will be compatible with things like M1 devices and things like that. It'll have a bunch of different architectures that it's designed for. As we get later into this, you'll see what are called features, which are sources of code that people have created that allow you to quickly spin up something. So if you were in the non-M1 space, I would have said, oh, well, it's really common these days to build Python applications and sprinkle in a little bit of Rust. So how do you do that? Well, you have to do that using a feature. Well, you can do that using a feature. You don't have to. But whoever created the Rust feature may or may not have used something that is compatible with that architecture. So that is kind of a gotcha that you might run into, that as you try to build more and more things, it's like, oh, I can just add all these features. There's a good workaround for that you can do as well. That actually is my preferred method of building dev containers, which is just have a Docker image and then install all the things that you know will work across the board, and then deploy from that custom Docker image, similar to what Tim was saying. Instead of saying, I'm just going to go type in this and then rely on, I love the open source community, but in this case, relying on people that I don't know, that may not have my architecture, that are developing things in a way that may not work with my device.
Okay, that's fair. And I think in general, not even just for dev containers, like if you're working on different architectures, and like this is an ARM device, right, that I'm on right now. But if you're pulling down, containers and images that are like x86, x64, like you need to consider like, okay, well, how do I emulate this different architecture and yada yada yada. But again, like that has nothing to do with dev containers itself. That's just, hey, in containers in general, running on different architectures have issues.
And another workaround to that is just use CodeSpaces, because CodeSpaces operate in a kind of in a format that tends to work in a universal way.
Exactly. So let's really quick talk about what's happened so far. So in the background, you saw the terminal spinning, right? And like I said, like VS Code pulled the image down and it started a server. I don't know what server it started, but it started some server. And it says at the bottom, it's doing port forwarding and all that stuff. And I guess we'll take a look at that in a second. But notice here inside of my Docker dashboard, this is just the vanilla Docker dashboard you get whenever you install Docker Desktop. This is nothing special or extra. When you open it, you can see now I have this amazing container that's running, right? Based on like this Microsoft.com/dev container Python thing that we got. And like there's nothing in it, which is expected. But I'm going to assume now, if I head over to my extensions, right? Notice how things look a little bit different, right? Here I can see my local extension. My local extension representing the thing that's actually on my machine, right? Because VS Code is still on my machine, right? VS Code is not in the container. It's kind of hosting the container. So this is what's on my machine. What's in the container itself, let's get rid of all this recommended stuff, is all of these other things that it installed, right? So these extensions for VS Code are running in the container. So this ESLint thing, a bunch of Jupyter Notebook renderers and slideshow, Pylance, there's a Python stuff, right? Some of the things that you'd probably need generically if you want to write some Python code, right? But again, imagine like me having to go, and again, I'm a lazy developer, right? I don't want to go, I want to click, install this, install this, install this, install this. I just spin up the environment and I have it, right? Another thing you might notice is the fact that it did take a little while to like spin up that environment. That's only going to happen the first time because I didn't have the image on my machine. It hasn't been set up before. So I'm saying if we stop the image, we're not going to do that right now. We're going to keep exploring. But if I stop the image and spun it up again, it definitely would not take as long for it to spin up because I'd already have those assets on my machine. So again, just another thing for you to think about if you've never done this before.
And I would ask, is there an extension that's in there that you would normally want that doesn't exist in there so far?
Let's see. What else do I use when I use Python? Usually I always have some type of, regardless of whatever code I'm writing, I'm probably putting it in a Git repo. So I usually like to add like some markdown editors and linters and stuff like that. So I add some markdown stuff to it.
Okay, so let's look in the extension store real quick and let's whatever your markdown editor of choice is.
Let's see, I just typed markdown as an example. So you have markdown.
You're missing a K in there.
Markdown.
Slide, folks, I promise. So you go like markdown all in one. That markdown snippets one is one that I've used before.
Yeah. So let's just find one of those and let's right click it real quick.
Yep.
We got to right click it. Okay, right click.
Yep.
So there's a couple of things here. So you see there's like an add to devcontainer.json. What that's going to do, and we can go look at the devcontainer.json file in a second, that's going to make it so that every time you open up this dev container, it's going to make sure that that extension is installed.
Always.
Now, there are some other ways to do that. I'm going to shameless plug myself. If you want to know those, subscribe to the VS Code channel on YouTube and check out the shorts because I've talked about them. You can also subscribe to my personal channel.
Nice.
So where I also talk about them. So you can do that. And if you install this now, it's going to install inside of the dev container as it is now. But the next time you have to spin up that dev container, it won't exist because you haven't told it that it should. So the image itself will have this. So I believe in, if someone in the chat that knows, correct me if I'm wrong, if you installed this now, you close out of this and you reopen it, it will still be there. But if for some reason for instance, you want to share this dev container with someone else, then they would have to go in and manually do this unless you tell that dev container, hey, I want this to automatically be included.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you right click that, let's add it to that devcontainer.json and take a look at that.
Okay, so it should be in there now. At least I think it is. So let's pop this open, dev container. Let's move some things to the side. I don't need this right now. And
it is not.
It should have been under customizations.
Maybe I didn't put it in.
Right.
Oh, you know what? I didn't hit the.
Oh, right click on it. Yeah.
You can use the gear or you can right click.
Add to dev container.
There we go.
So
there we go.
Now it shows in this customizations thing. That's over there.
And this is where some of the customizability of dev containers is so great because it's not only impacting your image itself, but it's also impacting the environment in which you are developing for. So again, the base dev container image took a lot of things for granted and said, hey, you probably want Jupyter notebooks, you probably want the Python extension and things like that. And that's in that base dev container image. But you can build on top of that and say, yeah, but I also want these things. I want GitHub Copilot. I want colorful or rainbow brackets. I want my markdown tools. I want the GitHub pull requests and issues. And you can set that up to say, I always want you. You can even add themes. So on top of that, you have your extensions. You can also add settings. Now, this to me is great because, again, I'm a Python developer. I work with multiple environments. That means there are often many forms of Python living on my computer, and I need to tell it which one to choose. So I actually set my Python path, and that allows me to do things like if I'm running black, if I'm running ISOR, if I'm running rough, there are a lot of settings that you can configure that you normally would configure inside of VS Code that I could say, I want everyone that is using this tool to have that. So if I say my dev container has, requirements.txt, which we can talk about that in a second, but I have rough installed, and one of my developer requirements is that we always lint with rough. Then from there, I can say, here are the settings. Here's the path to rough. It's in your local virtual environments file that'll get created.
Yeah.
Here are the settings that I want rough to use. Here are the things that I want it to ignore. And the person that's using this dev container does not have to be any the wiser. Rough just starts running, and like it'll just start linting and formatting. They'll get the little curly lines, and they can right click, and it'll go, "Oh, your imports are out of order. Let me go fix that for you." And you can set this environment up however you wish. And the best part is, and I'm hoping we can toss this over to Kedasha a little bit. All of this works in CodeSpaces. So the settings that you set here, if you open up CodeSpaces, all of those things will still be installed. All of those settings will still transfer over.
Is there a CodeSpaces extension? Can I install that?
So I popped the link in the chat to you, Cecil. So what I love about all this dev container stuff is that CodeSpaces makes it like 10 times easier, wherein you don't even need to set up a dev container on your project or your repository for it to work. For example, before we get to the templates, I want you to open up this open source project called Tech is Hiring. Great project, by the way, if you're looking for work. I want you to go to that repo and hit on the code button and hit open in CodeSpaces. And so as you can see here, we don't have a .dev container folder on the repository, but because GitHub CodeSpaces uses what I call the kitchen sink image from Microsoft. So it's going to just pull all-inclusive image that is going to allow this environment to magically open up in the cloud. And so this is what CodeSpaces look like if you don't have any configuration. Going to get a welcome, and then it's going to install your application so you can get started running and coding very easily. So here we're in a dev container, but we didn't have to configure a dev container. There you see it, it's running npm install to get the app going. It's a JavaScript project. And that's like super easy for you. So like if you have a current repository or current project and you don't have a dev container set up there, if you open up the project in CodeSpaces, you should be good to go. And if you want to add more configuration options or like more like, what is, it's not configuration, what is it?
Like settings, customizations.
Yeah. If you want to customize your environment more, then that's when you add your .dev container folder and a dev container.json file and get your customization on. You can even bring your dot files over to dev containers and even to CodeSpaces to get your project looking exactly the way that you want it to look, just as what Cecil was doing in his local environment.
That's really cool. And so just to highlight this super quick, so this is the website you asked us to go to. I'm going to put this up. So in case folks that are watching right now, in case you want to go over here and try this out too, this is, one second, I'm just going to put this up. So this is Tech is Hiring website. So like Kedasha was saying, if you look at it, there is no .dev container folder in there, right? And that folder is usually like the signal that, oh, this is being configured for CodeSpaces
dev container
or whatever the case is, right? Like, and it has those, the dev container JSON file and whatever other things it needs to run within that folder. But that folder doesn't exist here. But again, due to the magic of GitHub, right? Like we can hit the button, all right, and it'll spin up a code space for me. And now I think this is great because again, imagine, you're in a place that this is not your dev machine. This personally is not my dev machine. I just had VS Code on here. But like, I didn't have a lot of customized settings and those types of things. But I need to get work done. I could just come in here. I can open up CodeSpaces, and now look. Oh look, like I didn't install this theme. I got a theme in here. I got looks like it's installing stuff for me, which is great. Right, like it's gone ahead and spun up an environment that I could go ahead and just start running on things, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's take a second and let's kind of talk through the configuration, because we saw this setup one, we saw how to do it locally, and now we saw how to do it in GitHub. Let me take this website off the screen for a second. I'd love to spend like 10 seconds, maybe a little bit more than 10 seconds, actually take a look at the configuration file. And so we're back on containers.dev, right? This is like the home of dev containers. And I guess it's reference. I want to look and see what this dev container.json file looks like.
Yeah, so a lot of this are things that you do not need. Well, this is the actual spec. I don't think.
Sorry, I need an example.
If you go to like one of the templates, or even like on the main page, I think there's a container there, or like an example.
On the main page of this one?
Right
yeah, this is like super tiny. Hold on, let me see. Zoom. I'm gonna zoom in. All right, there you go.
Yeah, so even with this, there are a lot of pieces of this that are not required. Really, the only thing that's required is, I believe, the actual container that you're pulling from. Which there are two ways that you can define that. You can define it as we did in VS Code, where we said like, hey, here's the image that we're going to use. Do that. Or you can do what's called a build. Now, as a build, you're able to supply a Docker file, a Docker compose file, or I believe just an image path. And then from there, you can specify things. As we see here, we have, load this file, go into the variant, set up the variant, and kind of move from there. Right. And this will allow you, this would be the same thing as running, Docker run your image, or Docker build your image with, I don't even know the words for them. Docker build your image. Here are all the settings you need to supply. Then Docker run and some more settings. So that's what you're going to have there. And as you can see here, there's even like run arguments and other things that you can add on top of that. The second part that you're going to have are those customizations, which allow you to specify your environment the way that you want it to be set up. So this is where you could have, customizations in VS Code. That's what's on here for apparently what's a Go application. You can provide certain extensions. Again, you can provide certain settings. I believe those are the only two things you can provide in customizations for VS Code. But again, if you're operating in one of the JetBrains tools, or if you're operating in the CLI, you don't need all of this. So that's why you specify specifically for VS Code, enable these settings. And as more and more tools will adopt dev containers as a spec, then they can go and add the settings and extensions and other parameters that they would be looking for there. Okay.
I was just saying, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then there's the last step, which is kind of the like, do I want anything else to happen? Which I don't see that in here. But if you go to the reference, there are a couple of commands that we can look at that are like post create
command.
Yeah, forwarding ports. Hey, I want to make sure that you saw a bunch of ports were enabled. I want to enable port 8000 because I'm working on a Django app, and Django apps operate off of port 8000. And if you've ever tried to deploy Django with Docker, you know that you have to expose that port so that you can talk to, or you can talk inside of the container itself. So you have port forwarding that you can add. You can add labels for it that'll get picked up by certain editors. So VS Code, if you say this is my web port, it'll put that in the nice little web space for you. You can also do things like, again, post start command, post create command, post attach command, and initialize command. I have never used initialize command. I'm sorry. These run certain commands at certain stages of the process. So post attach, once you've attached to the container, run this command. Post start, once the container has started, you got it. and then post create. This post create is really cool if you're using something like Docker, or not Docker, like Django, and you need to like migrate your database. So, sometimes the first step in that is like, okay, hey, build this and then do a Django migration. So then you just put that in there. Or maybe you have a shell script that installs all of your Python requirements from a requirements.txt. You want to run those in different places just based on the design of your application, but you have the ability to do that and define that directly inside of your dev container.json.
Okay. There's one thing I wanted to talk to you about, excuse me, and that was features.
Yeah.
I don't know how new features is or not, but like I legit learned about it like a week or so ago.
You're on an M1 device. You don't get to use features unless it's in CodeSpaces.
I feel very much discriminated against.
I'm also on an M1 device, so I feel your pain.
I feel very much discriminated against. But let me know if this is accurate or not. So I see dev containers, or specifically like the dev container.json file, as a way that I could specify, here's how I want my environment to be set up. Like you said, my settings, if I want to use a custom Docker file or a custom Docker compose file, environment variables, yada, 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 right? Like what's the thing, what's the state I need this to be in, right? That's what the JSON file is for. Features is like someone else did that, or parts of that, and I'm just going to pull theirs in, and then I'm going to add mine on top of it. Can I think about it like that? Is it like building blocks, or not really?
I would definitely think of it as building blocks. I like to reference it as like, I got this Honda Civic, right? For people in the US, people in the US that don't know, like a Honda Civic is a car that's relatively inexpensive, and people love it because you can customize it, and you can get parts all over the world for it. So if I want a spoiler on my Honda Civic may not have come with a spoiler, but there are so many kits out there about how I want, like, what kind of spoiler do you want? And I just slap that spoiler onto my Honda Civic, and now my Honda Civic has a spoiler. If I want to add a new muffler, or something that makes it sound louder than it really needs to be because it's a Honda Civic, like, again, just throw that on there. Now, features kind of work in that instance, as I mentioned before, kind of with if I have a Python dev container template and I want to add Rust because I'm working on something that uses like PyOxide or something like that, then I don't need to necessarily rebuild my entire dev container. As long as the feature itself is designed to work with my architecture, I can say, give me the Python template and add the Rust feature. And that works in multiple ways. That works for if I want to do pipex, if I want to use something like poetry. We saw that there was like poetry. There's a Python with poetry template, or I could just use the Python container and then add poetry after the fact. Now, this all happens after the initial template has been built. So there's a caveat to this. Sometimes it's better to run it all inclusive inside of a single Docker file or Docker image that has all of these things set up. So you're talking about the template that has poetry and Python, or poetry and Rust. If there's one like that already exists, again, there are going to be maybe some other benefits there that, like, it's platform considered and many other things. The other side of that is if you don't have a lot of space and your image needs to be a little bit leaner, then adding the features after the fact might be a way around that. Actually, I know Pamela Fox put a comment in the chat about, for things that you don't want to figure out how to install inside of a Docker file, or you want to avoid them for performance reasons. Oh, sorry, rephrase. Features in general can cause a hit to performance because of how they're being added after the fact. But if the trade-off is I don't want to have to spend all day configuring this myself when someone else has already done it, then maybe it's worth that hit. And that's a decision that everybody has to make for themselves. I prefer to go without features. Again, a lot of features aren't designed with M1 devices in mind. So I just don't get to use them. But if I were in a system where I could use features, maybe features allow me to get up and running faster because I don't have to worry about, again, that time to configure added on top of time to develop.
Okay, that makes sense. So again, it's just bundled. It's bundled functionality or bundled configuration, and
Yeah.
I'm going to pull it in from somebody else.
Exactly.
It's like a package deal. Like, oh, I want some cherry on my ice cream, but I don't want to go pick cherries outside. So you go to the store and get cherries. So it's like you're going to the feature store and you're getting a CLI or you're getting PowerShell, like Manila said.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right. So Jay, I know you had sent me a repo. I think Kedasha, you sent me one as well. I don't know if this is the same repo, but this is this one Azure samples, right? And this one is a Django Postgres. I think ACA is what, Azure Container Apps?
Yes,
That's what
it
that
is Azure Container Apps. And the reason I sent this one to you, one, this was a great example that we put together for PyCon US that just happened.
Mhm.
But one of the really nice features of this is that what we did here was we created a dev container that works with the architecture in mind and is built off of an existing container. And you can go into that dev container folder and let's just explore for a little bit. So the first thing that we see there is we see a Docker file underscore dev, a Docker compose underscore dev, and a dev container.json. We're going to ignore the two Docker things and we're just going to focus on the dev container. Let's click on that.
Okay. So this one?
This middle one, dev container.json. There we go.
Great. There we go.
So inside of this, we see that there's a bunch of stuff happening. But the second thing that we see is that Docker compose file, and then we have two Docker compose files that we're pulling from.
Mm-hmm.
This allows us to create a baseline that we can use across the board, and then overwrite certain specifics with a second Docker compose file. And the reason that we did this was that we're using Azure containerized apps. So we have a setup that allows us to, take this containerized service, deploy this Django application that has a Postgres database that's using, Azure tools there, and it's using a key vault, and it has specific settings for that production environment. But when we go into our development environment, we don't want developers connecting to our production, Postgres database. We don't want them overriding things like that. We don't even want them using our existing production level settings file. We want them to use the development settings file because it's got all the stuff configured for them. We also want to ensure that there's a Postgres instance for them to connect to that's inside of the container itself, which is why we use Docker Compose. So we have one image that controls the Django application, one image that controls our test Postgres instance. And we have all the configurations set for that. So with that, what we're able to do is we're able to create an ecosystem that is designed for, are you the developer or are you the production machine? If you're the production machine, you don't have to know about any of the dev container stuff. If you are the developer, your dev container is going to look at the production stuff. It's going to overwrite the necessary settings using the developer settings that are there. And it's still going to present an application with as close to as possible a production environment. So if it works on your computer, it'll work in CodeSpaces, it'll work in the server, somewhere far, far away in outer space, as you mentioned.
If I say it works on my machine, that means it should work on your machine.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. That's pretty cool. I haven't seen a configuration like that yet, Jay. That's pretty cool.
And it gives us the ability, again, we have all of these settings here of like, hey, I want my workspace folder to be workspace, so that if you have a bunch of stuff that's not necessary, if you have things that are designed specifically for your cloud deployment, again, you don't need to expose that. That doesn't need to be in the purview of the developer. All of the ports that you need, port 8000 for Django, 5432 for Postgres, all of those different things, the different settings files. We talked about the extensions here, all of the different extensions that you want. We're using Bicep and AZD to deploy this, so you got to make sure that extension's on there. Rough, Python, Black, Bicep is in there twice, which is interesting. Need to figure out why that is. And then again, Markdown preview. I think one of the things that you said you always wanted to have in there. So we're able to then ensure that all of these extensions are enabled so that the development process is as similar to everyone developing as possible. So I don't have to worry about, well, I was using such and such tool to auto format my code. What if another developer doesn't have that tool? I don't got to worry about that. They have that tool because we gave it to them.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
This is very cool. So if folks are interested in this one, I'm going to go back to the top of the repo. If you head over to Azure Samples, github.com/Azure Samples, and it's under the Azure Django Postgres ACA one. And
there's a really easy short link for that, aka.ms/PyCon 2023 lab. That's actually going to take you through a walkthrough lab of this. At least I thought it was. Did I not?
Is there like a dash? aka.ms PyCon, Python or PyCon?
PyCon, like PyCon US.
2023, like no dashes or anything, right?
Yeah, I believe straight just lab after that.
Okay.
Yeah, there it goes. Okay, so this was from our PyCon repo. Unfortunately, I don't think you can qualify to win. We were giving away some stuff. That time has passed. But if you go through that, it'll walk you through the process of deploying this application. And we actually spend a lot of time talking about the setup of the application, including the dev containers that you go through.
That's awesome. So I feel like you've given us, like in closing, like another really good example of dev containers. And that is, hey, if I want to show off a demo application and I want you to run it, and it's going to be on GitHub anyway, now we can kind of have you can have a workspace where you can actually edit it, but then you can actually kind of have a deployment thing set up, right? Where you can actually, kind of walk through and have it deployed into the cloud. But then I can have everything here running on containers in, CodeSpace. But then now I go back to running in containers in outer space on Azure, and we can all kind of do it in the same space. So I feel like this is a good circle around, right? Because now, like, we're building stuff, we're teaching stuff, we're showing people how to deploy stuff, and then coming back around, now they're going to be building stuff and teaching stuff and stuff like that. And we're all using containers, we're using VS Code, we're using GitHub, and to create this experience, which I think is absolutely amazing.
Absolutely.
So, folks, we're just about at time. Kedasha, Jay, do you have any last? I was about to say, do you have any final words? But that sounds a little morbid. Do you have any final closing statements? Like anything you want to share with folks? Anything you want them to know about? Any additional links you want them to go to while we're here?
I think in terms of links and other resources, these are the ones that we've set up. They're there. I as soon as I said microwave, I was like, challenge accepted. Someone's gonna make that happen. You push 30 seconds and it deploys. I like it. But try it with CodeSpaces first, because I think getting it to work for you, that first time I'm starting with nothing, and now I have this environment. I do think is just truly magical, and I think that is a great. I don't want to say accessibility, but it is a leveler. I call it a floor leveler, where whether I'm on a Raspberry Pi, whether I'm on a Chromebook from 2007, or whether I'm on a Mac Studio that's fully maxed out, I can operate with the same level of performance across the board, and I don't have to worry about compute because that's being handled outside. Everybody gets 60 hours for free. Am I right on that, Kedasha?
Yes, 60 hours.
Okay, I always say the wrong number. So yeah, you get 60 hours for free a month. So
every month.
I know a lot of people that this is the only way that they write code is within CodeSpaces, and they do it absolutely for free. Once you have like, okay, I got this, but I want to play with it a little bit more, start small. Start with what's already there, use those templates, use those features, and then when you feel like that's not serving you, start diving in. And then the only other the only caveat that I will say to that is if you've already got an environment that works and it's already in a Docker file, just point it to that and see how that works, because I have so many times started like, oh, this is a container. Now I have to Docker run. What are the commands that I need? And if it just saves you time and not having to enter all of the Docker run commands, over and over again, because you will forget them. I forget them all the time. It's okay. We're not designed to remember these things. That's why
Yes.
computers do it. Let the computer do it. Let the dev container manage all of that for you, so that you just got to do, open your command palette, open in dev container, or even better, once you open VS Code inside of that project, you should get notified, hey, there's a dev container here. Do you want to open it? In which the answer is yes.
Yes. And I guess I'll just say, like, even if you don't know Docker, you don't need to know Docker to work with dev containers.
Right.
You can get started easily on GitHub where your code is. Click that code button, open it up in CodeSpaces, and you can work in a container just like that. And if you have no idea what dev containers are, I do have a blog post that will teach you how to automate your dev environment with containers and GitHub CodeSpaces. And we also have a lot of templates for you to start with if you just want to explore what this whole containerization thing is. You can use one of our templates. If you hit the CodeSpaces button on GitHub, it takes you straight into an environment that you can start exploring with. But I think like one of the best things about dev containers is that it just makes the configuration stuff so much better and so much less stressful. Like you can go through the struggle of setting it up one time, and then you just have to work on maintaining it, but you'll be good to go.
Awesome. Well, you two, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you all as always. For everyone that's watching, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Hope you all learned something new. Hope you all try out dev containers and let us know what you build. Let us know what you think about it. Right? I'm sure the team is always looking forward for feedback. I think we did share the repo. It's github.com/dev containers. Super simple to remember. Head over there, submit your issues, let them know how it's working for you. And yeah, go ahead and be awesome, right? And build cool stuff. With that being said, thank you all again, and we'll see you all next time. We'll be back next week, Wednesday, for another episode of Stripe Dev Chat. Right? Bye, everybody.
Bye.